No bride of the Duke of Ashland had ever survived her wedding night. London society tracked the pattern with morbid fascination. 6 duchesses in 5 years, 6 funerals under cold skies, so when church bells rang for his 7th wedding, the bets were already placed before the cake was cut. 3 hours, 4 if she's stubborn. But no one, not even the gossips who fed on tragedy, imagined this. The candles in the Duke's bedchamber had burned low, their flames trembling against dark-panelled walls. Rain tapped softly at the windows. The storm that had followed the wedding feast had finally quieted, and still the new Duchess of Ashland slept. Her dark curls lay tangled across the Duke's bare chest, one hand curled loosely over his heart, as if she did not know she lay beside the most feared man in England. Caspar Cornwall, Duke of Ashland, had not moved in nearly an hour. He barely dared to breathe, his body rigid beneath hers, every instinct sharpened toward vigilance, because this was wrong, impossible. She should be cold by now. Another ghost to join the others. A loose strand of her hair brushed his skin with every rise and fall of her breathing. The physician's untouched vial still rested on the bedside table. Untouched tonight, his new wife had looked him directly in the eye and quietly refused. "I do not swallow unfamiliar medicines from men I met yesterday, Your Grace." The memory nearly startled amusement from him even now. Stubborn woman, reckless, infuriating woman. He should have insisted, should have explained. Instead, he'd watched her fight sleep by the fire, wine-loosened and muttering curses about arrogant dukes who spoke in riddles, until she simply folded against him like she was meant to be there. Now her cheek was warm against his skin, and as a tiny sleepy sigh escaped her throat, something dangerous shifted inside him, because he found himself thinking, "If anyone harms this woman, I will burn England to the ground." His throat tightened. Fool. He had promised himself he would not care, especially not this time. Not when she had been brought here for reasons she did not yet understand. Not when Ashland Manor held secrets capable of ruining them both. The corridor outside creaked. Caspar's entire body went still. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the pistol hidden beneath the mattress. Isla stirred but did not wake. 3 measured knocks sounded at the chamber door. Only one man knocked like that. Caspar's gaze dropped to the sleeping woman in his arms, soft, defenseless, alive, and for the first time in memory, real fear sliced through him. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe. I'm a new creator, and your support goes a long way. 3 weeks earlier, the ballroom at Lady Featherby's estate glittered under the crystal chandeliers. To Isla Maren, the room smelled faintly of desperation, perfume layered over sweat, champagne masking debt. At 24, Isla had already learned the humiliating truth of London society. Beauty had an expiration date, charm eventually ran dry, and poverty turned even the loveliest women invisible or worse, pitiful. She stood near a marble pillar, pretending not to notice the glances directed toward the carefully mended hem of her sage-green gown. Last season's silk, retailored twice. "You are glaring at the aristocracy again," her cousin murmured. Amelie brushed beside her, cheeks flushed from dancing. "You do realize men dislike women who appear clever?" "Then perhaps they shall leave me in peace," Isla replied. Amelie groaned. "You cannot continue terrifying every eligible bachelor." "Eligible," Isla repeated. "The Viscount with the wandering hands, or the Baron, who explained politics to me incorrectly for 20 minutes. A laugh escaped her cousin despite herself. Then a ripple moved through the crowd, heads turned, fans fluttered faster. Someone important had arrived, and before Isla could turn, she heard the whisper drift through the crowd like the first warning of an approaching storm. The Duke of Ashland, a strange hush followed the name. Not admiration, not excitement. Just that particular silence people reserve for things they both fear and cannot look away from. The Duke did not need to announce himself. He simply walked in, and the room adjusted around him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with midnight black hair swept back from features so sharply handsome they bordered on indecent. His evening coat was severe black, unrelieved by any flash of colour. No one rushed forward, no mothers shoved their daughters into his path, only careful, wary distance. "He doesn't look particularly murderous," Isla murmured. Amelie nearly choked on her wine. "Isla, they say his third duchess was found with bruises around her throat. They also say Lady Pembroke bathes in champagne," Isla replied. London does love a good story. But even as she said it, she couldn't stop watching him. He moved through the crowd with quiet detachment, acknowledging greetings with minimal nods, never smiling, never lingering. As if sensing her gaze, their eyes met. A strange stillness passed through her. His eyes were a deep, stormy grey, not cold, but heavy with something worn and exhausted. For a heartbeat, the noise of the ballroom faded. He didn't look away, nor did he approach. He simply regarded her as though startled to find her standing there at all. Then someone claimed his attention, and the moment broke. Isla let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Well," Amelie said, eyes wide, "that was intense. You're imagining things. I am not. The Duke of Ashland just stared at you like he forgot how to blink." Before Isla could respond, a liveried footman appeared at her elbow. "Miss Maren? His Grace wonders if you might honour him with the next dance." Amelie made a sound close to a squeal. Isla considered pretending temporary illness or sudden death. Both felt preferable. Yet curiosity, dangerous and unreasonable, had already begun unwinding inside her. "Very well," she said. The ballroom seemed unbearably warm as she crossed toward him. Up close he was somehow more unsettling, not because of his size, though he towered over most men in the room, nor because of the faint scar disappearing beneath the edge of his collar. It was the stillness, like someone perpetually braced for impact. "Miss Maren," he said, offering a perfect bow. His voice was low and rough-edged. "Your Grace." "You appear disappointed," he said. Her eyebrows rose. "At being asked to dance? At discovering I have neither horns nor blood on my hands?" To her horror, a small laugh escaped her. As the music began, his palm settled at the small of her back, warm and sure through the thin silk. He guided her effortlessly, but she felt the coiled restraint in every movement, as though he were holding back a storm. "You are not afraid of me," he observed after a turn, quiet enough that only she could hear. Isla met his gaze without flinching. "Should I be? I find rumours make poor dancing partners, Your Grace. I prefer facts." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer, something shifting behind them. When the music ended, he didn't let her go right away. "Walk with me in the garden." The request should have alarmed her. No respectable woman slipped away with a man like him after one dance, and yet there was something about the way he asked that unsettled her resolve. Besides, if she were honest with herself, she wanted to know what sort of man carried that much sadness in his face and still managed to frighten half of London. "I fear for your reputation." "Your Grace," she said lightly as he escorted her toward the terrace doors. "If we're seen, people might think you're trying to compromise me." Caspar glanced down at her, the corner of his mouth curving again. "Miss Maren, London has assumed far worse of me for years. A garden walk is hardly going to tip the scales." The evening air was cool and damp, carrying the sweet scent of rain-soaked roses. Music from the ballroom drifted faintly behind them, softened by distance. The Duke walked beside her, hands clasped loosely behind his back as though determined to appear unthreatening. For several moments neither spoke. Then he said, without warning, "Your brother's Oxford education is in danger." The abruptness nearly stopped her in her tracks. "You investigated me?" "Yes, no apology, just fact." "You're in debt," he continued evenly. "Your family home will likely be lost by winter. Your prospects are poor, and you know it." Heat stung her cheeks. "Well," she said coolly, "I see your reputation for charm has been exaggerated." The corner of his mouth twitched. My reputation in general has been exaggerated. He stopped beside a stone bench overlooking the shadowed gardens. Lantern light carved sharp angles across his face. Up close, the exhaustion in him was impossible to ignore. I dislike wasting time, he said quietly. So I shall be direct. You require security, I require a wife. The ground seemed to shift beneath her. I beg your pardon? A 1-year marriage of convenience. Your debts erased. Your brother's education paid in full. Your home secured. At the end, financial independence, yours alone. No performance, no seduction. Just raw, unflinching certainty. You can't be serious. I rarely joke. Miss Maren, why? Isla asked slowly. Would the Duke of Ashland require a wife under contract? His gaze drifted toward the dark stretch of hedges beyond the path. Because permanence has not served me well. She hesitated, then asked the question burning in her throat. What happened to your other wives? Caspar went very still. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and guarded. As long as you follow the conditions I'm about to give you, you will be safe. That is the only promise I can make. A chill traced down her spine, but she held his gaze. He continued, 3 conditions. Never enter the West Wing after midnight. Never dismiss any household staff without telling me. And if I ever tell you to run, you do so immediately, without question. A strange chill slipped through her. Isla searched his face for mockery and found none. What exactly, she asked slowly, would I be running from? His gaze drifted briefly toward the dark line of hedges beyond the path, as though some answer lived there. The thing, he said at last, I do not yet have proof of. Far behind them, laughter spilled faintly from the ballroom. Somewhere inside, mothers continued arranging futures over champagne, while daughters smiled until their cheeks ached. A temporary marriage. Enough time to secure Thomas's education. Save the house, breathe again. There is one practical concern, she said after a moment, forcing steadiness into her voice. What becomes of me when you require an heir? Something shifted in his face then. You will never be required to give me anything you do not willingly offer. The answer caught her off guard, not because of the words themselves, though they were unexpectedly honorable, but because there was a flicker of longing so quiet and quickly hidden it startled her. Isla drew in a slow breath. Very well, Your Grace, she said, I'll marry you. 3 weeks later, Isla woke to warmth. That was the first impossible thing. The second was the steady rise and fall beneath her cheek. For several disoriented seconds, she did not understand where she was. The room smelled of rain-damp wood, clean linen and cedar. Her head ached with the dull consequence of too much wedding champagne and too little food, and when she shifted, a hand tightened instantly at her waist. Isla opened her eyes. Her cheek was resting against the bare chest of the Duke of Ashland. For one suspended moment, she forgot every language she had ever known. Then the memories returned in scattered, humiliating pieces. A church full of people watching as though waiting for an execution. Amelie weeping into a handkerchief while trying to look encouraging. The wedding breakfast bright and loud, every laugh sharpened by curiosity. Wine pressed into Isla's hand again and again. Ashland Manor appearing through rain like something out of a nightmare. She lifted her head too quickly and regretted it at once. Pain flashed behind her eyes. Careful, Caspar said. His voice was rougher than she remembered, as though he had not slept. Isla froze. He was awake, and worse, he was looking down at her with an expression so unexpectedly gentle that she nearly wished for arrogance instead. I seem to have misplaced several hours, she said with as much dignity as one could manage. Her gaze dropped in panic. She was still wearing her night rail, though the robe had slipped from one shoulder, and his hand had already moved away from her waist, as though he had realized a second too late that she might object to its presence. Nothing happened, he said quietly. The speed of his answer should have embarrassed her. Instead, it loosened something tight in her chest. Nothing. His mouth curved faintly. You accused me of being impossible, refused to drink Dr. Harwick's tonic, fell asleep during your own lecture, and then made a determined effort to use me as furniture. Heat swept up her throat. How mortifying. I have endured worse. Yes, she said before she could stop herself. So London keeps reminding me. The words landed heavily. His expression did not change, but the easy warmth between them cooled. Isla wished immediately that she could take it back, though she'd no idea why she should feel guilty for repeating what everyone else already believed. Before she could smooth the moment over, a heavy thump rattled the door, then another, followed by a deep, disgruntled huff. That, Caspar said, with a thread of amusement in his voice, is Brick. As if summoned by insult, the door pushed open. A massive grey muzzle shoved through the gap, followed by the rest of what could only be described as a small bear wearing a hound's disguise. Brick was enormous, barrel-chested, floppy-eared, the solemn face of a judge who had seen better defendants. He stared at the bed, he stared at Isla, and he gave one loud disapproving sneeze. Then he trotted straight to Caspar's side, completely ignoring her. He dropped his massive head onto the mattress with a groan. Isla couldn't help it. A surprised laugh escaped her. Does he always announce himself like an offended butler? Only when he feels his territory has been invaded, Caspar replied, his fingers sinking into the thick fur behind Brick's ears. He's mostly deaf and entirely convinced the world revolves around his nap schedule. That almost smile returned, and despite her headache, despite the awkwardness of the morning, Isla felt the strange little pull of it low in her chest. Then she remembered the sound from the night before. 3 measured knocks. She had not dreamed them. Someone came to the door last night, she said, watching him carefully, after I fell asleep. Caspar's hand stilled briefly in Brick's fur. House business. At that hour? A faint line appeared between his brows, gone almost as quickly. Ashland Manor has never had polite timing. The answer arrived too smoothly, yet the tension had returned to him all the same. She noticed the way his shoulders had gone subtly rigid again. I will have breakfast sent up, he said, rising from the bed with careful restraint, as though conscious of every inch of himself in the room. And something for your head. By noon, Isla understood 3 things about Ashland Manor. First, it was undeniably beautiful. The corridors were wide and panelled in dark wood polished to a glassy shine. The windows tall enough to catch the grey spill of winter light, the carpets thick enough to swallow footsteps. Portraits lined the walls, but too many spaces between them had been recently emptied, leaving pale rectangles where frames had once hung. Second, the servants were exquisitely trained and deeply afraid. They curtsied, answered, then vanished. Conversations died when she entered rooms. One maid nearly dropped a tray upon seeing Isla. No one held her gaze for long. Third, her new husband was determined to be formal. By luncheon, Caspar had become your grace again in every movement. He sat at the far end of the dining table as though distance had been deliberately enforced. He inquired politely about her headache, spoke of the weather and her new household allowance with immaculate courtesy, and offered nothing more. If she had not woken against his chest that morning, she might have believed the coldness. But she had felt the way his hand had tightened at her waist before he remembered himself. She had seen the faint crease of concern between his brows when she winced at the light. She had watched him move the wineglass from her place setting and replace it with tea, sweetened exactly enough to settle her stomach. A man could lie with words, but bodies were far less disciplined. That afternoon, seeking refuge, she found the library. It was a sanctuary 2 stories high, smelling of leather, dust, and old fires. For the first time since arriving, Isla felt something inside her unclench. She chose a scandalous French novel from a lower shelf and curled into a chair near the hearth. Brick appeared 20 minutes later, regarded her with deep suspicion, then collapsed at her feet with a big sigh, as though sharing space with the new Duchess was a grave personal sacrifice. Do not pretend affection, she told him dryly. I know disdain when I see it. Brick closed his eyes and pretended to snore. When a tray arrived some time later, Isla assumed it was tea. Instead, she found something far more surprising. A proper meal had been arranged. Warm bread, sharp cheese, sliced apple, a small pot of honey, and tea strong enough to wake the dead. Enough food for someone who had skipped a breakfast and barely touched luncheon. The servant disappeared before she could ask questions. Only after setting down the teacup did Isla notice the folded note resting neatly atop the tray. The handwriting was precise. You did not eat breakfast. Please attempt not to starve yourself out of stubbornness. Also, your gloves appeared to be losing a determined battle against winter. Look beneath the tray. Her gaze dropped. Tucked carefully beneath the edge sat a pair of new gloves, supple sage green leather, beautifully made, exactly her size. For a long moment, Isla simply stared. Her own pair had begun splitting near the fingers. She remembered suddenly the brief glance Caspar had given them the previous morning as she struggled to pull one free. Isla opened the novel again and fixed her attention on scandalous French aristocrats, pretending very hard that she was not smiling. The days that followed settled into a rhythm too peculiar to be peaceful. Caspar remained cold in public, all restraint and distance whenever servants were present, but small betrayals of attention followed Isla through the house. A fire already lit in whatever room she favoured, a shawl appearing over the back of a chair after she shivered once at breakfast. Fresh ink on the writing desk after he noticed her, shaking the last dry drops from the old bottle. He did not ask whether she was lonely. He simply made the house less cold. Dr. Harwick visited every other morning. He was a soft-spoken man with pale, elegant hands and a pleasant manner. He asked after her sleep, with gentle concern. His Grace worries more than he admits, the physician said one morning, setting a small crystal vial on the table beside her. A mild restorative. Many ladies find their nerves unsettled after marriage. How fortunate, Isla replied, that my nerves have chosen rebellion over delicacy. Harwick offered a polite smile. When Caspar entered a few minutes later, his gaze went immediately to the untouched vial. Without a word, he crossed the room, picked it up, and slipped it into his coat pocket. My wife requires breakfast, he said, voice even. Not tonics. Harwick's expression remained pleasant, but the skin at the corners of his mouth tightened just slightly. Of course, Your Grace. That evening, she returned to the library and found her French novel missing. In its place sat a heavy volume of sermons. She opened the cover and discovered the scandalous book neatly tucked inside the hollowed-out pages. A surprised laugh escaped her. From the doorway, Caspar's low voice carried across the room. Your taste in literature is alarming, Duchess. She turned, clutching the disguised book to her chest. You hollowed out a sermon? It was a dull sermon. You stole my novel. I rescued the household's moral reputation. By reading it yourself, she countered. His mouth curved in that rare, devastating, almost smile. I wanted to know what had made you blush at page 47. Heat flooded her face instantly. You read page 47? I read enough. Her mortification deepened. Page 47 involved a moonlit carriage, several missing buttons, and language scandalous enough that even Isla had briefly considered prayer. That, she said carefully, refusing to retreat, sounds suspiciously like an invasion of privacy. I considered it marital due diligence. The warmth in his voice startled her. Not flirtation exactly, something quieter, more dangerous. Because he looked amused, yes, but also curious, as though he had discovered something unexpectedly delightful about her and had not yet decided what to do with it. You are impossible, she said. So I have been told. His gaze lingered, long enough that the room seemed to shrink slightly around them. The fire crackled softly, warm light catching along the sharp line of his jaw. Isla became suddenly acutely aware of the fact that they were alone, that she was standing in her husband's library while he looked at her as though he had forgotten whatever careful distance he usually carried. And? She asked before good sense could intervene. Did page 47 meet expectations? A flicker of surprise lit his face. I found it unexpectedly educational. You are enjoying this far too much, immensely. The word landed low and warm somewhere beneath her ribs. He had stopped closer than she realized. His hand lifted slightly, then stopped, as though some instinct had urged him forward only for discipline to drag him back. And then, out of nowhere, Brick shoved his enormous head firmly between them. The interruption was so abrupt Isla nearly laughed. The hound leaned heavily against Casper's leg with the determined possessiveness of someone reclaiming territory. Casper exhaled through his nose. You are impossible to compete with, he told the dog. Brick huffed once, deeply satisfied with himself. He appears convinced you belong to him, Isla said. I'm afraid he has held that opinion for too many years. For a moment, standing there beside the fire with scandalous literature hidden inside sermons, and Brick firmly reclaiming his duke, Isla could almost imagine this strange marriage had been born of something gentler than desperation and secrets. Then movement caught her eye. Past Casper's shoulder, near the far end of the corridor, a young housemaid slipped quietly through the archway leading west, balancing folded linens against one hip. She moved quickly, disappearing beyond the shadowed stretch of hall before Isla had properly registered it. The West Wing. Isla's attention sharpened. You must never enter the West Wing after midnight. The memory of his voice returned with unsettling clarity. She looked back toward the corridor. The maid had vanished. A few moments later, another servant emerged carrying an empty basin. Forbidden, apparently, did not mean abandoned, only forbidden to her. Something in the realization lodged unpleasantly in her chest. Casper noticed the shift in her expression. What are you thinking? He asked quietly. Isla glanced away quickly. Nothing of importance, she said, her voice light but distant. His gaze lingered on her, as though he knew perfectly well she was lying but had chosen, for now, not to challenge it. The moment softened again, but the seed of curiosity had already taken root. Because Isla had never possessed the temperament required to leave mysteries untouched. Over the next 2 days she found herself noticing things she had not before. Doors near the west corridor remained closed, yet servants came and went at odd hours carrying linens, trays, sometimes bundles she could not identify before they disappeared from sight. Whenever Isla passed too near, conversations quieted. By the third evening, her curiosity had swollen into something far more inconvenient than suspicion. It felt personal now, so when midnight settled over Ashland Manor and sleep refused her entirely, Isla finally surrendered to instinct. She rose quietly from bed, wrapped herself in a dressing gown, and lifted a candle from the mantel. She told herself she would only look, which, she knew perfectly well, was the sort of lie women told themselves immediately before making terrible decisions. The West Wing was colder than the rest of the house. Her candle flame trembled as she moved past shrouded furniture and portraits turned toward the wall. The air smelled faintly of lavender, preserved too carefully to be abandoned. At the end of the corridor stood a door with a newer lock than all the others, but it was not locked. As she quietly nudged it open, moonlight spilled across a room untouched by time, shelves lined with picture books, a painted rocking horse standing faithfully beside the hearth, tiny folded embroidered blankets. Nothing had decayed, nothing had been forgotten. Someone still cared for this room. Isla stepped inside slowly, her throat tightening. On the far wall hung a portrait. A young woman in pale blue silk, dark-haired, fine-boned, solemn around the eyes, the first duchess, not Isla, and yet close enough that, in dim light at a distance, a grieving man might look twice. A cold, humiliating thought unfolded inside her. Was that why? Had she been chosen not because she was practical, but because she resembled a dead woman whose place he wanted filled? Behind her, the floorboard creaked. Isla turned sharply. Casper stood in the doorway, his face pale with something worse than anger. I told you not to come here, he said. She lifted her chin, though her pulse hammered hard enough to hurt. His gaze moved past her to the portrait, then back to her face, and in that silent exchange she saw too much. Guilt, grief, fear, and something that looked very much like pain. She could have apologized. Instead, she asked the question that had been growing teeth inside her since the ballroom. "Did you love any of them?" The candle trembled in her hand. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally answered, his voice was so quiet it seemed drawn from somewhere bruised, not the way people imagine. It was not the answer she expected. He stepped into the room but kept his distance, as though afraid she might flee if he came too close. "I cared for them," he said. "I tried to protect them, but I failed everyone." Isla looked again at the portrait, at the careful preservation of the room. The jealousy that had flared in her moments before softened into something more complicated, more aching. "And me?" she asked before pride could stop her. His gaze found hers. "You," he said, each word controlled with visible effort, "are the first person who has ever made me forget to be afraid." Caspar took a step closer and Isla did not move away. His hand lifted, then lowered again as if touching her had become a question he had no right to ask. The restraint in him undid her more thoroughly than any boldness could have. For a single breath, she thought he might lean in and kiss her. For a single breath, she wanted him to. Then footsteps sounded rapidly in the corridor. Caspar turned before the knock came, his expression closing like a blade returning to its sheath. A man in his 40s stood beyond the door, rain glistening on the shoulders of his dark coat. His face was drawn, eyes sharp with urgency. Water dripped steadily onto the polished floorboards. "Your Grace," he said, voice low and clipped. "We have a problem." His gaze shifted to Isla. "Duchess, my apologies. I had hoped our first meeting might be under less dramatic circumstances." There was nothing flashy about him, no jeweled pin, no fashionable tailoring. Yet he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had long ago learned that survival mattered more than appearances. Caspar's jaw tightened. "This is Mr. Sewell." The name meant nothing to her, but the way Caspar said it did. There was trust there, worn thin by strain. "Sewell handles matters requiring discretion," Caspar added. "An elegant way of saying I clean up messes," Sewell replied mildly. Caspar glanced down the shadowed corridor, then back at Isla. She saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the instinct to protect her by sending her away, the knowledge that she had already seen too much, and the quiet fear that every word spoken in her presence might drag her deeper into whatever darkness lived here. She braced for the inevitable dismissal. Instead, after a long, tense beat, he said, "Come." Sewell led them to the library. The fire had burned low, casting long, restless shadows across the shelves. Brick, sprawled beneath the desk like a disgruntled rug, lifted his massive head with a grumpy huff. Sewell waited until the door clicked shut. "I found the account." Caspar's expression barely changed, but Isla caught the subtle tightening at the corner of his mouth. "Which account?" she asked. Sewell glanced at Caspar, but Caspar hesitated. Isla's fingers tightened around the candle holder until the metal bit into her palm. "If this concerns the forbidden wing, the physician who keeps offering me mysterious tonics, or the man who knocked on our door on our wedding night," she said, voice steady but edged with steel, "then politeness has officially expired." A faint sound of approval escaped Sewell. Caspar's eyes stayed on hers, dark and unreadable in the low firelight. Then he gave one short nod. Sewell opened a worn leather folio and removed several pages. "His Grace has had me reviewing household accounts, staff movements, physicians' records, and the circumstances surrounding the late Duchess's deaths." The room seemed to grow colder around the words. Isla stood very still. Caspar's gaze fell to the fire. His hand tightened on the back of the chair until his knuckles went white. "You suspected something," she said softly. "I suspected many things," he replied quietly, "none of them in time." Sewell placed the first sheet on the desk. At first there was nothing that would satisfy a magistrate. Great houses are full of waste. Servants steal. Ledgers are amended. Physicians make mistakes. Every explanation was possible, which made every accusation useless. Sounds like you mean to say everyone lied very neatly, Isla said. Sewell glanced at her again. Precisely. He tapped one page with 2 fingers. Irregular payments began 3 months before the second Duchess died. Small sums at first, then larger. Some went to servants who left service abruptly after each funeral. And most recently, some have reached Dr. Harwick. Isla thought of his pale hands setting a vial beside her teacup. She kept her face still. But you do not know who's behind it, Isla concluded. Sewell's mouth flattened. No, the account is old and cleverly obscured. Whoever controls it has taken pains to remain invisible. Isla moved closer to the desk. The papers were covered in names, dates, figures, notations written in Sewell's precise hand. She had expected horror to announce itself plainly, but this looked ordinary. Ink, columns, receipts. The quiet arithmetic by which a house might become dangerous. Caspar watched her read, and something in his expression shifted when she did not recoil. "The night of our wedding," she said, looking up at Sewell. "Did you knock because of this?" Sewell inclined his head. "A footman reported unusual movement near your rooms before midnight. Nothing conclusive, but enough to worry me." "Everything worries you," Caspar added. "Only when warranted." Isla looked between them. And was it warranted? This time Sewell did not answer, but Caspar did. Yes, over the following days the library became their secret battlefield, not officially. Officially, the Duke and Duchess of Ashland spent their evenings reviewing household matters. In truth, once the servants retired, and the house grew quiet, they worked side by side under the warm glow of lamplight and dying embers, shoulders nearly touching, voices low, the space between them slowly shrinking with every shared page. At first, Caspar tried to shield her, sliding certain documents away. Isla simply reached over and took them anyway. She brought her own observations to the desk. Harwick's repeated interest in her sleep, the way he phrased rest as treatment and wakefulness as danger, the vials that appeared whenever she complained of fatigue, the mild surprise in his face each time he discovered them untouched. "You think the sleeping draughts are important?" she said one night, turning toward him. Their faces were suddenly very close. Caspar didn't move away. "I think my wives were all encouraged to sleep deeply," he murmured, "and they never woke up." The quiet pain in his voice made her chest ache. Without thinking, she rested her hand lightly on his forearm. His muscles tensed under her fingers, then slowly relaxed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then lifted again, darker than before. Brick, who had been snoring by the hearth, suddenly lifted his head. He lumbered over, wedged his massive body between them, and flopped half his considerable weight across both their laps with a heavy, contented sigh. His tail thumped lazily against the chair leg. Isla laughed softly and scratched behind one floppy ear. To her surprise, Brick leaned into her hand, eyes half closed in pure bliss, as if he had finally decided she was acceptable. "Has he decided I'm the better option?" she asked softly. Caspar's low laugh rumbled through his chest, smart. His hand brushed hers as they both petted Brick, fingers lingering. Then, quieter, almost to himself, he added, "He's not the only one affected by you, Isla." The words hung warm in the space between them. When she looked up, Caspar was watching her with an intensity that made heat bloom low in her stomach, guarded, hungry, and unmistakably tender. Brick simply nestled deeper into her lap, tail still thumping, slow and steady, as though personally endorsing the moment. From then on, the nights grew less grim. They still argued, fiercely, brilliantly, over missing receipts and suspicious payments. But the arguments were laced with something new, a spark, a reluctant smile when she won a point. The way he began ordering trays of food before difficult conversations, because he'd learned she argued better when she wasn't hungry. The way she noticed when exhaustion lined his eyes and quietly pushed a cup of sweetened tea toward him. One night, After a particularly long stretch of grim reading, Caspar looked at her across the desk, firelight softening the hard lines of his face. "I'm beginning to learn," he said quietly, "that underestimating you is a dangerous habit." Isla met his gaze, heart beating a little too fast. "Extremely dangerous, Your Grace." By the end of the week, they had something like a shape. The duchesses had all been given remedies for nerves, sleep, palpitations, weakness. Each had declined rapidly. Each death had been blamed on heart failure. Harwick's salary had doubled shortly before the third death. A hidden account had funneled money to servants who vanished soon after. But while they could see the pattern, they still couldn't see who held the leash. The discovery frightened Isla, but it also made her angry. These women had been real. They had scribbled witty notes in the margins of books. They had been people, not cautionary tales. And someone had turned them into proof that Caspar was cursed. Late one night, long after Sewell had left and the candles had burned low, Isla found folded note tucked into the back of a packet from Lady Featherby's ball. She almost missed it, tucked beneath a list of attendees and debts. Her name appeared halfway down the page. Isla Maren, father deceased, mother missing, brother dependent, estate heavily encumbered, limited protection. Her stomach turned. Below it, in Sewell's precise hand, recommended to his grace by Edmund Cornwall, matches prior profile perfectly. The room seemed suddenly too quiet. Caspar had been standing near the shelves, one hand braced against the ladder, searching for an old household register. He turned when she did not speak. "What is it?" Isla stared at the paper, willing the words to rearrange themselves. "Who is Edmund Cornwall?" Caspar went still. "My cousin." She lifted her gaze. "It says here he recommended me at the ball." The realization hit her like cold water. "You knew," she whispered. His face had lost color. "Isla." "No." The hurt rose sharp and sudden in her throat. "When you danced with me that night, had you already decided I was useful, that I fit your pattern?" Pain flashed across his face, raw and unguarded. "I thought I could control it. I thought if I watched closely enough, if I kept Harwick away from you. You used me as bait." The words landed between them like broken glass. Caspar looked at her then, not as a duke, not as a man in control, but as someone watching something precious slip through his fingers. "I never meant for you to become real to me." The quiet admission cracked something deep inside her chest. All those thoughtful gestures, the gloves, the trays of food, the fires lit before she entered a room, the way his hand had lingered against hers over Brick's fur, the rare, devastating smiles he gave only to her. She had started to believe he saw her. Instead, she had been studied, chosen, positioned. "I think," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I would like to retire." He didn't move aside at first. For one reckless heartbeat, she thought he might reach for her. But then he stepped back. Isla walked past him, every step feeling heavier than the last. At the door, his voice followed her, low and rough. "Isla." She paused but didn't turn. "Tell me one thing," she said quietly. "If I had died, would you have called it failure or just more evidence?" Behind her, Caspar remained silent. And because silence had already answered too many questions tonight, Isla left him standing among the scattered papers, the dying candles, and the ghosts of women who had once trusted this house too. Isla did not sleep. She returned to her chamber with the composure of a woman walking away from a fire, and closed the door before her hands began to shake. Pride kept her upright while she dismissed her maid. Pride carried her to the washstand, where she splashed cold water on her face until the sting in her eyes could be blamed on something other than the ache in her chest. She had been foolish, not in marrying him. That decision had been survival, and Isla had been ashamed of surviving. No, the foolishness had come later, in the small, treacherous moments she had allowed herself to keep. Warm gloves beneath a breakfast tray, the sound of his rare laugh in the library, the way he had looked at her in the West Wing, as if wanting her had become a weakness he no longer knew how to hide. She had mistaken usefulness for tenderness, Morning arrived grey and frostbitten. Isla had already packed 2 trunks by breakfast. When she told her maid to have a carriage readied for London, the girl curtsied too quickly and fled. Caspar did not appear at breakfast. Of course he didn't. Instead, Sewell found her in the dining room shortly after 9, hat in hand, expression carefully neutral. "His Grace has gone to locate Mr. Edmund Cornwall," he said. "He left before dawn." The name struck like a finger pressed into a bruise. How convenient. Sewell didn't flinch. Mr. Cornwall became difficult to find after last night's discovery. Men do have a talent for vanishing when accountability approaches. At times, Sewell said, it is their most practiced skill. She almost smiled. His gaze softened by a fraction. His Grace asked that you stay a little longer. At least another hour. There are matters still in motion. You'll be safer here. Isla placed her napkin beside a plate she had not touched. His Grace is very good at deciding what's best for me without asking where I wish to be. Before Sewell could answer, the sound of carriage wheels crunched over gravel outside. Not the heavy Ashland coach. Something lighter, faster. A footman burst in, pink-cheeked from the cold. "Your Grace, a gentleman has arrived." Isla's heart gave one painful, traitorous lurch. Not Caspar, she told herself. The young man who burst into the entrance hall wore a travel coat dusted with road grit, his dark curls wind-tangled, his grin too bright. For one stunned second she couldn't move. Then Thomas crossed the hall and caught her in an embrace that smelled of cold air, ink, and the faint tobacco he pretended not to smoke at Oxford. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice muffled against his shoulder. "Happy Christmas to you as well." "It is not Christmas for another week. Then I am early. Scholars are encouraged to be ambitious." She pulled back, searching his face with the sharp, protective instinct that had kept them both alive these past years. "How did you come?" Thomas's smile softened. "Your Duke sent for me weeks ago. Said you'd been pretending not to miss me rather poorly." The words landed softly, like a blow she hadn't seen coming. Caspar had arranged this quietly, without announcement, without asking gratitude. "Isla?" Thomas's grin faded as he took in her expression. The trunks by the stairs, Sewell's watchful silence. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said. Too quickly. He raised an eyebrow. "You always say nothing when the ceiling is actively falling in. Then perhaps you should stop arriving in collapsing houses. I go where the education is richest, despite everything." Isla let out a shaky laugh. She pulled him into another hug, holding on tighter than she meant to. For the first time since the night before, the sharp edges of her hurt felt just a little less jagged. By midday, Thomas had already turned the house upside down in the best possible way. He greeted Brick with a formal bow and called him Sir, and was rewarded with a sniff that nearly knocked him backward. "Excellent," Thomas said gravely. "We understand each other perfectly." Isla watched them, and for half an hour she almost remembered how to breathe. But their carriage to London kept being delayed. First a cracked wheel, then worsening weather, then one of those vague household complications that seem to sprout like mushrooms in great houses. By late afternoon, she had retreated with Thomas to a small sitting room, where he paced before the fire. "You cannot simply leave your husband after 3 weeks, Isla. I assure you I can." Thomas dragged a hand through his curls. "Did he hurt you?" The question sobered the room instantly. "No," she said, too quickly. "Not the way you mean." Thomas studied her. "Then what happened?" She looked toward the frost-laced window. "I discovered I was useful to him before I was anything else." Thomas said nothing for a beat before resuming his pacing. "You are impossible when wounded," he said. "Do you know that? You become very calm and begin arranging your own heartbreak like furniture. Oxford has made you poetic. How unfortunate. It has made me observant. No, Thomas, it has made you expensive," he snorted, then reached absently for the nearest cup and drank. Isla noticed the faint, bitter edge beneath the bergamot a second too late. Her attention sharpened. "Thomas?" He looked at her over the rim. "What? Set that down," he frowned. "It's only tea." But within minutes, The colour began to leave his face. At first he made a joke of it. Too much travel, too much cold. Perhaps Ashland's grandeur had oppressed him. Then his hand went to the arm of the chair, gripping hard. His breathing changed next, shallow, uneven, as though each inhale required thought. Isla rushed to his side as his knees buckled. He went down hard, and she caught him as best she could, sinking to the floor with him. She screamed for help with a voice she did not recognize as her own. The house exploded into motion, footsteps, shouts, servants rushing in. Thomas lay grey and clammy against the carpet, his breathing frighteningly thin. Grey cast, shallow breath, comes on fast. Casper's words from the library rang in her head like a death knell. Isla shoved the terror down and acted. Warm water, she ordered sharply. Salt. Mustard from the kitchen now. The nearest maid froze. Isla's voice cracked like a whip. Now chaos erupted. She loosened Thomas's collar, held him through the convulsions, forced the mixture down his throat and made him retch. It was ugly, brutal work. She ignored the tears burning her eyes, the sour smell, the terrible vulnerability of it all. "Forgive me," she whispered against his damp hair as his body jerked. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Sewell arrived before Harwick. One look at the scene, the cup, Thomas on the floor, Isla's fierce, shaking hands, and his face hardened. "Where is Harwick?" she demanded, being fetched. "Keep him away from my brother." Sewell didn't argue. He simply nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. "Move Thomas to the blue room," she continued, voice steady now. "No one enters except you, me, and the maid I choose. Nothing leaves my sight." Sewell gave another short nod. Thomas was still pale and weak when they finally got him upstairs, but his pulse had steadied. He drifted in and out, muttering about Latin verbs and accusing Brick of cheating at cards. Only when his breathing evened did Isla lean close. "Thomas," she whispered, "the tea. Who brought it before I entered the room?" His lashes fluttered. "Girl," he mumbled, freckles, brown cap, looked scared. "Did she say anything?" "Asked if it was for your sitting room." Isla closed her eyes for one heartbeat. When she opened them, the softness was gone. She found the maid in the narrow servants' passage, cloak half fastened, a small bundle clutched to her chest like a shield. The girl saw Isla and went deathly pale. For one frozen second neither moved. Then the maid bolted, but she didn't get far. Brick, who had been lying like a grumpy monument outside Thomas's door, suddenly heaved himself up with surprising speed. He barreled down the passage, planted his massive body directly in the girl's path, and sat. The maid skidded, crashed into his solid shoulder, and bounced backward onto the carpet with a startled cry. Brick looked deeply offended by the collision, then leaned his considerable weight against her legs, so she couldn't scramble up again. Isla arrived seconds later, breathing hard, fury burning cold and clean in her veins. "Good boy," she told him, voice low. Brick thumped his tail once, clearly proud of himself, and gave the maid a slow, judgmental side-eye. The girl started to cry. "I didn't know," she whispered, shaking. "I swear I didn't know what was in it." Isla crouched in front of her, calm and precise. "My brother may die because of what you carried into that room. So listen very carefully. I already have enough to send you to the magistrate. The only question is whether you go alone, or tell me who gave the order." The girl trembled so violently her cap slipped sideways. "I can't. He said he'd ruin my family." "He may still try," Isla said, "but I am here right now. He is not." The maid glanced desperately down the shadowed corridor, then back at Isla. Her voice was barely a breath. "Mr. Cornwall." Isla's stomach tightened. "Edmund Cornwall?" The girl gave one terrified nod. "He said the Duchess always took tea in the afternoon. Said it was only to make you sleep, that no one would be hurt if I just did as told." For a moment nausea rolled through Isla. Then she stood, jaw set. "Put her in the pantry off the north kitchen," she told Sewell, who had appeared silently at her shoulder. "Lock it, water only. If Edmund is waiting for word from her, he must not receive it." Sewell's eyes sharpened. Silence might make him think the plan worked. "Or failed," Hessler said. Either way, uncertainty makes men careless. Sewell looked at her then, as though seeing precisely why Caspar had lost. "Yes, Duchess." She returned to Thomas's bedside. His colour had improved slightly, but he still looked too pale, too fragile. When she brushed his wrist, his fingers curled weakly around hers. "Do not die," she whispered, voice cracking. "I'm far too angry to mourn you properly." Then she rose, went to the writing desk, and picked up the pen. Her hand was steady now. She wrote quickly, the words sharp and urgent. No greetings, just the truth. When she finished, she stared at the final line, the two words that revealed far more than she had meant to. She folded the note with careful precision, sealed it with wax, and handed it to Sewell's fastest rider. "Make sure he gets this tonight." Only after the hoofbeats faded into the winter dusk did the weight of what she had written settle over her. At dawn, Isla heard the thunder of hooves first, then the slam of the front doors. She had been sitting beside Thomas for hours, one hand wrapped around his wrist, counting every fragile beat as if sheer will could keep him here. When Caspar appeared in the doorway, he looked like a man who had ridden through hell. Rain-soaked coat, wild dark hair, face pale beneath the hard line of control. His eyes found her immediately. Not Thomas, not Sewell, not the anxious servants, only her. For one raw second, everything he felt was written across his face. Relief, fear, and something deeper that made her chest ache. Then he crossed the room in long strides. "Thomas?" he asked, weak, breathing steadily. Sewell stepped forward. The maid named Edmund. "But we have no confession," Isla said. Her voice was hoarse. "Only a frightened girl and a brother who drank what was meant for me." Caspar's jaw tightened at that. For one dangerous heartbeat, she saw the man London feared, the one with blood on his hands and ghosts in his eyes. But the fury in him wasn't cruelty. It was grief sharpened into a blade. "I found where Edmund had been," he said. "He slipped away before I arrived." "He'll be waiting for word from the maid," Isla said. She stood slowly, exhaustion warring with resolve. "So let the house whisper that the Duchess is gravely ill, same symptoms, same progression. Let it reach him through whatever ears he still owns here." Caspar stared at her. "No." Isla almost laughed. Even now, after everything, he still tried to protect her by locking her out. Caspar. His name slipped out, soft and unguarded. He looked at her, and for a moment the Duke vanished. "No," he repeated, quieter. "I will not use you as bait again." Something in her chest twisted. "You won't be," she said. "This time I'm choosing it. That doesn't make it safe." "No," she agreed, "but it makes it mine." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. His hand flexed at his side, as though he wanted to reach for her, but didn't trust himself to stop. Caspar's gaze never left hers. "I seem to have married a woman with no regard for her own safety," he muttered. The corner of Isla's mouth curved. "And I seem to have married a man who still believes he can protect me by pushing me away. We make quite the pair." A short, wrecked breath of a laugh escaped him. He dragged a hand through his wet hair, then looked toward Thomas, pale but breathing, and back to her. "Very well," he said at last, "but we do this properly, together." By noon, Ashland Manor had learned to lie. A maid was sent weeping down the back stairs. A footman whispered in the stables. The cook allowed 2 kitchen girls to accidentally overhear that the new Duchess had taken a sudden, alarming turn. Sewell made sure one servant known to carry messages heard exactly the right lies. By afternoon, Isla lay in the same bed where she had first woken, on Caspar's chest. The curtains were drawn low, the fire banked to a sullen red glow. Her hair spilled dark across the pillow, her face lightly powdered to drain the colour from her cheeks. A teacup sat untouched on the bedside table. Brick had taken up position across the threshold like a furry sentinel. Caspar stood by the window, motionless as carved stone. "You're staring," Isla said softly. "I'm making certain you keep breathing, and thinking about how I should have told you everything." The confession landed between them like a stone in still water. Isla looked away first. "Yes, you should have. I thought knowledge would make you a target. I was already a target the moment I said yes to you. Before he could answer, footsteps sounded in the hall. Sewell entered with a magistrate in plain dark clothes and Dr. Harwick beside him. Looking 10 years older than he had the day before, his pleasant composure had collapsed into something grey and sweating. Harwick would not meet Isla's eyes. Sewell spoke low. He has confessed enough to hang himself twice over. And Edmund? Caspar asked, voice like iron. He'll come, Isla said from the bed, calm and certain. He thinks I'm dying. He won't be able to resist seeing it for himself. Caspar's gaze snapped to her. You're sure about this? He asked, voice rough. I'm sure I'm done being a pawn, she replied. This time I get to move the pieces. Brick chose that moment to rise, pad over to the bed, and drop his massive head onto the mattress beside Isla. She scratched behind his ear, and the dog leaned into her touch with growing adoration. Caspar watched them, something soft and aching crossing his face. Even my dog has chosen your side. The waiting stretched through the grey afternoon and into evening. Tension coiled tighter with every creak of the old house. Then at dusk, wheels crunched on the gravel drive. Edmund had arrived. He came exactly as Isla had predicted, not in panic but with calculated concern. His carriage rolled to a stop, and he stepped out in a dark blue coat, rain glistening on his shoulders, his face arranged into perfect familial worry. My cousin sent word the Duchess is unwell. His voice drifted up from the entrance hall, warm and smooth. I came as quickly as I could. Isla's pulse kicked hard. She met Caspar's eyes across the room. The trap was sprung. Edmund entered the chamber with the easy grace of a man who believed he still controlled the story. He was handsome in a polished, golden way, fair where Caspar was dark, smiling where Caspar was stone, but beneath the charm lay something sharper. Caspar, he said, crossing to the bed with urgent concern. God, is it true? Caspar stood at the foot of the bed. She worsened this afternoon. Edmund approached the bed slowly, voice dropping to a respectful hush. Poor girl. He stepped closer, studying the still figure with clinical interest. Isla kept her breathing shallow, eyes mostly closed, every nerve alight. Edmund sighed. You know, I had hoped this one might last longer. Caspar's voice was deadly quiet. For my sake? Yes, yours. Something sharper entered Edmund's voice. God knows you have punished yourself enough. Caspar's expression gave nothing away. You speak as though this house punishes me unfairly. Oh, come now, Edmund said softly. Must we continue pretending? He turned toward the fire, staring into it. You inherited Ashland and abandoned it to ghosts. The tenants came to me. The creditors came to me. Do you know how many winters I spent repairing disasters you were too grief-stricken to notice? His tone remained calm. That was what made it dangerous. You disappeared, Edmund continued, finally turning back toward Caspar. And yet somehow the burden remained mine while the glory stayed yours. Caspar folded his hands behind his back. You stole from the estate. I preserved it with murder. Edmund's jaw shifted faintly. Careful, he said quietly, that word invites unpleasant consequences. You seem familiar with unpleasant consequences. Amusement flashed across Edmund's face. You think I enjoyed any of this? Servants begged me for wages while you wandered these halls like grief had made you holy. Caspar's face gave nothing away, but Isla saw his hand close slowly at his side. I kept this house standing, Edmund continued. I kept your name intact while you let it rot around you. With stolen money, Caspar said. With money that should never have been solely yours. Edmund's mouth twisted. You were born first. That was your genius. That was all it ever took. And the women? Caspar asked, voice dangerously quiet. Edmund's eyes flicked toward Isla in the bed, collateral. Isla felt the word in her bones. Caspar took one step forward. Edmund lifted his chin. Do not look at me as though you are innocent. You married them. You brought them here. The cruelty struck because it had been aimed where Caspar already bled. Isla could feel him absorbing it, could feel the old guilt rising. Enough. She opened her eyes. No, she said softly, the colour drained from Edmund's face. Isla sat up slowly, the powder-pale illness giving way to the sharp, living anger beneath it. You do not get to blame your murders on his grief. For one fractured second no one moved, then Edmund recovered. "Duchess," he said, with a smile that trembled at the edge. "What an extraordinary relief." "Is it?" The connecting door opened. Sewell stepped in first, followed by the magistrate and a trembling Dr. Harwick. Edmund's gaze darted between them, understanding dawning too late. For the first time, real fear flashed in his eyes. "You planned this," he said to Caspar, voice low. "Ashland would have collapsed without me." "Enough," Caspar cut in, voice like iron. "It ends here." Thunder rolled outside as the magistrate stepped forward. Edmund Cornwall finally looked like what he was, a man cornered by the very women he had tried to erase. The house didn't transform overnight, but slowly, room by room, Ashland Manor began to breathe again. Servants spoke in normal voices. Doors stayed open past sunset. The west corridor lost its teeth. Thomas recovered with the stubborn cheer of a younger brother, determined to milk every ounce of sympathy. Brick appointed himself guardian of the sick room and growled at anyone who approached with tea. Caspar visited every evening. Some nights he brought tea and sat in comfortable silence. Others he shared quiet reports from London. Once he arrived with an absurd crate of oranges because Thomas had grumbled about missing them. The sight of the stoic Duke hauling fruit like a market boy made Isla's heart clench, but he never asked her to stay. A week later, Thomas was strong enough to travel. The morning of her departure, soft rain kissed the windows. Caspar walked Isla to the carriage in silence, Brick trailing behind like a mournful shadow. "You could simply remain," he said at last, staring at the carriage wheel as if it held the answers. The quiet hope in his voice nearly broke her. She smiled, small and sad. "There you are," he frowned faintly. "Where?" The man who finally asked instead of assuming. Something raw and vulnerable flickered across his face. "I am late to many things, yes," she whispered. "I need to go." His throat worked. "I shall miss you unbearably." The raw honesty of it nearly undid her. She touched his coat once. "Good." His startled, ragged laugh chased her into the carriage. A letter arrived weeks later, black wax, precise, elegant hand. Caspar wrote of the dance where he first noticed her, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she looked at him without fear. He wrote of their wedding night, waking in terror because she'd fallen asleep on his chest, and the urge to protect her had felt indistinguishable from breathing. The gloves, the library, the way he'd nearly kissed her in the West Wing and realized fear had become a coward's excuse, and at the end, "I stopped hoping long before I met you. Then you arrived, and survival suddenly felt unbearably insufficient. I would burn England to the ground for you, Isla. I realize now I should have simply asked if you wanted to stay." Isla read the last line until the words blurred. Then she laughed through the tears she no longer tried to hide. Thomas looked up from his book. "Duke trouble, hopeless Duke trouble. Are you going back?" She folded the letter with trembling fingers. "Yes, I think I am." 2 nights later, rain whispered against the windows of Ashland Manor. Same room, same low fire crackling in the hearth, but this time, Isla entered by choice. Caspar turned from the window so fast it was almost undignified. He looked hopeful in a careful, wounded way that made her chest cave in. "You came back," he said, voice rough with disbelief. "Well," she said lightly, "someone has to stop you from making catastrophic decisions unsupervised." The words cracked something open in him. "You're an impossible woman. You do seem rather fond of impossible things." He crossed to her slowly, stopping just short, close enough that she felt the warmth of him, far enough to let her choose. "I love you," he said, the words tumbling out as if they'd been fighting their way free for weeks. "I've spent weeks trying not to say it." Her breath caught. "You," he continued, looking faintly horrified by his own candor, "are infuriating, reckless, and abysmal at following instructions. I seem to have survived you anyway." "Barely." His voice cracked on the word, And in that single fracture, she heard every sleepless night he'd spent terrified she was gone for good. Terrified love had come too late. Terrified he'd ruined the only light left in his world. The ache in her chest bloomed into something fierce and tender. "You don't get to love me from a distance anymore, Caspar." His eyes closed briefly. "If you stay, Isla, I will spend every day trying to deserve you." That shattered the last of her defenses. She kissed him first, deep, hungry weeks of yearning and want pouring out at once. His hands found her waist with visible effort at restraint, but it lasted all of 3 seconds before he pulled her flush against him. He kissed her back like a man who had walked through winter and finally found home. When they broke apart, breathless, foreheads pressed together, Brick nudged the door open with his massive head. He bounded straight for Isla. In his mouth he carried a slightly rumpled but clearly treasured object, one of Isla's gloves, the one she had absent-mindedly left in the library before she left. He dropped it at her feet, then sat back on his haunches with an expectant look. Isla stared for a beat, then burst into delighted laughter. "Is this a dowry or a bribe?" Caspar murmured. "He's been hoarding that since you left. I caught him sleeping on it twice." Brick gave a satisfied huff, leaned against Isla's leg, and tilted his head up at her with pure adoration. No more territorial side-eye, no more dramatic sighs, just a large, ridiculous dog who had officially declared her part of the family. She crouched down, scratching behind his ears with both hands. "I accept your terms, Sir Brick. Truce?" His tail thumped hard enough to rattle the doorframe. Then, apparently satisfied with the negotiations, he flopped across the threshold, effectively guarding the room and them from any further interruptions. Later, as the rain gentled against the glass and candles burned low, Isla fell asleep with her palm over Caspar's heart. For the first time in years, Ashland Manor slept without ghosts, only love and the quiet snores of one very self-satisfied hound who had finally approved the match.
How was this story from 1 to 10? If you liked it, please subscribe for more. Thank you.